Welcome to Habeas Treasures, where I try to decipher this book, There's Treasure Inside by Jon Collins-Black, in order to find one of the 5 hidden treasures. On today's episode, I'll continue my breakdown of the Pokemon Box chapter and explain why I think the author starts the story in New Orleans and how he might be using jazz and the Jar of Flies to make the leap to West Baden Springs, Indiana. Let's begin! In an earlier video, I reviewed how I think the author has structured the Pokemon Box chapter as a mirror where the first half of the story in New Orleans reflects the second half of the story with the Froakie. The story in New Orleans begins at a hotel and then ends at a jazz bar. And the story with the Froakie starts at a jazz bar and then ends with the author reviewing pictures in his hotel. So at a high level, the mirrored structure is hotel to jazz bar to hotel. When the author is in the New Orleans jazz bar, he makes the following reference. It was as if I had walked through Kirk's wardrobe or Alice's looking glass. It seems like most people interpret the importance of this line as a reference to Lewis, since Kirk's wardrobe is from the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S Lewis, and Alice's looking glass refers to the book Alice Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carrol. My thought on this is that the double Lewis reference, coupled with the fact that the author is in a New Orleans jazz bar, could point to another Lewis as a clue. In this case, Louis Armstrong, the famous jazz musician from New Orleans. Why Louis Armstrong? Well, in a much earlier video, I reviewed why I thought the author was possibly referencing Lisa Simpson with the baritone saxophone line, which entices the young author to enter the jazz bar. She is arguably the most famous baritone saxophone player in the world, and is the only reason I could come up with for mentioning that specific instrument. And if you think about it, the Simpsons have a lot of similarities to Pokemon. Both are long-standing cartoons of roughly the same vintage that also spawn movie and video game franchises. But more importantly, the Simpsons had an episode where the family goes to New Orleans and Lisa gets advice from the ghost of Louis Armstrong.
What are things in heaven?
You know that thing we used to call reefer and you people now call medicine?
I do.
Well, they have it up in heaven and it is mighty fine. Mighty fine.
But in addition to that, it turns out that Louis Armstrong was a big fan of Pluto water sold at the French Lick Resort in Indiana. In fact, he was such a fan that sometimes he would sign off on his letters, Pluto waterly yours, Louis Armstrong. He even stayed and performed at the resort, and his picture can be found on their famous guest wall. I think the author uses the magic wardrobe and the magic looking glass, along with Louis Armstrong, as sort of a portal connecting New Orleans and Indiana. I admit it's a bit of a far-out concept that rightfully should be met with some skepticism, but in future videos, I promise I'll give some more context on why I think this may be what the author is intending for us to do. For now, let's turn our attention to the mysterious jar of flies that's mentioned in the second half of the story with the Froakie. The author writes, "But I did pick up a jar full of flies from the local pet store to bring with us for a snack." And he follows this up a few sentences later with this line, "As we drove, we listened to some John Coltrane. It seemed appropriate." Now, a number of people have pointed out that the jar of flies could refer to this famous drawing by John Coltrane of his musical theory, The Circle of Fifths. I tend to agree with this conclusion since the two sentences in the story appear close to one another, which supports this connection. But what does it mean? And how does it help us find the treasure? Well, here's my theory. In my previous videos, I've suggested the author might be making repeated references in the story to the Jesuits, and specifically their former seminary at the West Baden Springs Hotel. Now, I won't rehash all of that here, but if you're interested, you can watch those videos to learn more. Instead, let's look at what's perhaps the most famous phrase in Jesuit teaching, ad majorem Dei gloriam, which means for the greater glory of God. This is the official motto of the Jesuits and is often abbreviated AMDG. And when I was studying John Coltrane's famous song Giant Steps, I noticed that one of the major chord changes was similar, A minor, DG. And in another coincidence, the chord is a 2-5-1 chord, which shares the same numbers as the author's age in the story, 5.5. In fact, I learned that the 2-5-1 chord is often referred to as the jazz chord because of its prominence in jazz music. Listen to this.
So important to jazz that if you mastered this chord progression, you've essentially unlocked hundreds of jazz standards because it is by far the most common chord progression in all of jazz music, and that is the 2-5-1 chord progression. So
anyway, who knows if any of this is right? I'm barely literate in music, so take all this with a grain of salt. However, I know the author is a musician, so it's possible that to him, these famous chords and songs would make a good clue, especially if you wanted to link music in a cool way to the famous Jesuit motto, AMDG, using Jon Coltrane and his circle of fifths. Okay, that's all I've got for today's video. On my next video, I'll explain why I think the author is combining Fortnite, the video game, with a Linkin Park song to lead us to Indiana.